Early season whitetail hunting can feel very unpredictable at times. You're gonna have one food source that's completely loaded with deer and then another food source that's a complete ghost town. Now the difference usually isn't the food itself, but how that food connects to nearby cover. And when you can combine that food and cover with terrain that works in your favor as a hunter, you start stacking the odds for early season success. So in this video, I'm going to break down each of these elements, food, cover, and terrain, and show you exactly how they tie into consistent early season whitetail hunting. We're going to look at how these strategies apply to both public and private land. So no matter where you hunt, you're going to have a framework that you can use this season. And to bring it all together, at the end of the video, I'm going to walk you through a real early season stand location, a setup that's already proven itself with success. So by the end of this video, you're gonna have a clearer picture of how exactly you can take the guesswork out of early season whitetail hunting and give yourself the best chance to punch that early season tag. By the way, I'm Greg Kazmersky. I design and improve whitetail properties that create predictable opportunities and unlock the land's full potential. And I'm building a community of growth-minded hunters who want to take their whitetail strategy and success to the next level. So let's dive in. Now, it's no secret hunting public land and hunting private land can feel like two completely different worlds. And arguably, the biggest difference comes down to one thing: how many variables you can actually control. On private land, you can shape the habitat, set the strategy, and control the pressure. And on public land, you've got to hunt what's already there and accept the fact that another hunter or even just someone hiking through can change your hunt in an instant. Now, that doesn't mean that early season success on public land is out of reach. In fact, I believe that there are a few principles that actually give you an edge. The first one is very simple: think like a deer. If you can understand how deer live day to day on the piece of public land that you're hunting, you can build an approach that gives you consistent opportunity. The second is timing. Most public land gets a limited amount of pressure in the early season. So if you can find a pocket that hasn't been hunted yet, oftentimes that deer movement is going to be extremely predictable. Sometimes being the very first hunter in a piece of public land can be your best shot at a buck the entire season. Now, private land is a whole different story. When I work with landowners, we're building out a habitat plan that creates opportunity throughout the season while protecting the core of the property. Secure hunter access is always going to be the #1 priority. It does not matter if it's the early season, the heart of the rut, or a late season hunt. If the deer know you're there, the entire plan falls apart. So I actually talk about secure hunter access and the rest of my 5-step whitetail habitat blueprint in another video. I'll link that here. Now, on private land, I also think much more conservatively than I do when I'm hunting public land in the early season. Why exactly? Because I have the ability to control the hunting pressure on private land. So early season hunting on private might mean filling doe tags on low impact setups or waiting for the perfect window to move in on a buck that's on a vulnerable and consistent pattern. Either way, I'm going to use food, cover, and terrain to identify those stand locations that are designed for the early season. Now let's go ahead and move on to food, the thing that dominates early season whitetail hunting. Now, the hot food source is going to vary depending on where you hunt and when your season opens. If you're in a state that opens in early September, bean fields can be one of the most consistent destination food sources that you can find. But if you're not in ag country, or if those beans are already drying up by opening day, my favorite thing to target is white oak acorns. And if I can find an isolated white oak tree dropping acorns, that's about as close to the jackpot as you're going to get. Also, the woods is very alive and very green this time of the year. It's filled with natural browse, and that natural browse is going to make up a very large part of a deer's diet. So if you're scouting out a stand location for the early season, make sure you're always keeping an eye out for browse lines. These browse lines can be key in predicting travel patterns that lead to destination food sources. Now, if you do have food plots, staging area plots, or kill plots, whatever you want to call them, can be deadly in the early season. I typically like to make my staging area or kill plots about 1/4 to 1/2 acre in size between bedding and destination food sources, and shaped to flow with the natural movement of deer. Now, I prefer to target these smaller food plots over destination food sources, so that way after the deer pass through the plot, I can exit out of my stand location when the deer have made their way to that destination food source for the evening. I actually take a deep dive into staging area food plots or kill plots, whatever you want to call them, in one of my design breakdowns. It's about a 150 acre property here in Ohio. I'll go ahead and link that video here. Now, here's the biggest thing to keep in mind about food and the early season: it only works if it's unpressured. So on public land, that means finding the hot food sources that aren't obvious from the main access points or road glassing spots. success. On private land, it usually means staying out until conditions are right, because if you have a hot food source on private land and it hasn't been pressured, that deer movement is going to be very consistent. So dialing in the right food source at the right time and keeping it unpressured is one of the best ways to find early season success. Now for me, good cover next to a food source is what makes that food source hot in the early season. Deer are typically going to be on tight bed to food patterns this time of the year, and they're not motivated to move far with the warmer temps that we typically see in September and early October. If you think about it, when it's really hot out, people don't exactly want to jump up off the couch, go outside and go for a long jog. Deer are exactly the same way. They want the shortest and safest route from their bedding areas to their food source. So that's where cover comes in. Deer rely on low level cover to stay hidden from predators, and in the early season with everything green and alive, that cover is everywhere. As long as you're not looking at a fully mature closed canopy forest, which honestly I never recommend hunting, you can usually find some level of cover to work with at the beginning of the season. So when it comes to public land, what exactly am I looking for on a map when it comes to early season bedding locations? Three main things that change depending on where exactly I'm hunting. That's going to be creek bottoms, overgrown fields, and logging cuts. A creek bottom is the flat ground running alongside a creek. It often has thick, low vegetation and stays cooler in the heat. An overgrown field can be one in the off year of planting in a crop rotation or an area dedicated to habitat. These are filled with both cover and a ton of browse. And logging cuts are areas of young regeneration where timber has been harvested, creating thick bedding cover, also with a lot of browse. The key is to make sure that these bedding areas are very close to food, because again, deer are not moving very far. And bonus points if that bedding area is positioned on the downwind side of that food source. Obviously, wind direction is going to shift, but deer generally prefer to travel with the wind at least somewhat in their face. It lets them use their most powerful sense, their nose, to scan for danger as they head towards food. So this can help you start to predict which bedding areas are going to be active during what winds and allow you to plan your access routes accordingly. Now on private land, this is something that we can actually design for. When I work with landowners, we strategically place bedding improvements away from planned hunter access routes. That way you're not going to bump deer on their short bed to food travel patterns. But on public land, deer live a completely different life. They'll bed in whatever cover is available, wherever they're not going to be bothered. And don't ever think a piece of cover is too small to hold a buck on public land. Some of the biggest deer that I've ever seen bedded on public land are going to be in places that you'd walk right past simply because they're not pressured by anyone. So once you've got food and cover dialed in, terrain is going to be what gives you as the hunter an opportunity for a high odds early season setup. Here's what I mean. The terrain is going to shape exactly how the deer want to naturally move between bedding areas and food sources. And certain terrain features condense that movement, putting that activity right in bow range. This is where those terms like pinch point, travel funnels, and bottlenecks all come into play, and where map reading can really start to reveal the story of deer movement in your area. Now, I've been fortunate enough to be reading topo maps since I've been 7 years old. And speaking from experience, the more you practice, the easier it becomes to spot those subtle features, the little contour oddities where deer movement really stacks up. Now, I actually put together another video where I break down the 5 key terrain features that I always like to use when it comes to crafting a hill country whitetail strategy. If you haven't had the chance to watch that video yet, I'll link it here. A lot of those same features in that video can apply to these tight bed to food patterns in these early season setups. Now, if you're hunting in flatter country, edges and habitat transitions are going to take the place of terrain that funnels deer movement. No matter where it is, deer naturally want to follow something that takes them from point A to point B. And because deer are on these short bed to food patterns in the early season, they're almost always going to take the path of least resistance. Once you know where the deer bed and where the deer feed, the habitat or the terrain is almost always going to reveal the path that these deer naturally want to take. Now, how exactly you apply this knowledge is going to look a little bit different on public land than it is going to on private land. On private land, you can always design habitat improvements around these terrain features that are going to condense deer movement. So you can have a well laid out travel corridor through a terrain funnel connecting bedding to food. Now on public land, those obvious pinch points that you might design your plan around on a piece of private may already have a stand in them. And for me, that's okay, because anytime I'm out hunting public land, I'm always okay continuing to scout until I find a place that I'm extremely confident in, even if it doesn't really show up as an obvious pinch point on the map. So let's go ahead and put it all together. I'm gonna walk you through a real stand location and show you how exactly food, cover, and terrain work in your favor for the early season. This is actually one of my favorite early season setups, and it's on a farm here in Ohio where I've been working with the landowner for a few seasons. On this property, we're right in the heart of farm country. Food is the first piece of the puzzle. In the bottom field, we've got a series of smaller, intentionally shaped food plots. And just beyond these food plots are large ag fields that serve as perfect evening destination food sources in the early season. The smaller plots stage the deer, and the large ag fields draw them out for the evening. Now, cover comes in multiple forms here. Inside the timber, there's these canopy openings that have exploded with low-level growth, a mix that creates multiple bedding opportunities, and right next to it, there's an old clear cut that's grown into thick, dense cover. Together, these give deer secure bedding within an easy reach of food. Now, here's where the terrain takes this stand location from good to great. As the hillside flattens out into a creek bottom, there's this narrow strip of flat ground that's only about 20 yards wide. We open this up as an easy travel route, and the steep hillside on one side paired with the washed out creek bank on the other naturally pinches deer movement. And right in that pinch point, we hung a mock scrape. And sure enough, it sees consistent buck activity as they make their way to the food plots. It is the perfect cherry on top for this setup. Finally, we have our hunter access. We come into the stand extremely clean by looping up the opposite side of the creek away from both bedding and food. This allows the hunter to slip into the stand location undetected, keeping pressure off the core part of the property. Now, when you can layer food, cover, terrain, and secure hunter access together like this, you're gonna get a stand location that produces consistent opportunities. So here's the big picture when it comes to early season hunting. Food is gonna be what gets the deer moving. Nearby cover is going to be what makes the deer feel secure enough to use that food source in the daylight. And terrain is what gives you as the hunter the opportunity to intercept these deer on those short bed to food travel patterns. When you start layering those three together, you move from guessing to building high odds setups. And that's what early season success really comes down to. Now, if you're ready to take the next step in your strategy, I'd love for you to check out my Next Level Whitetail SKOOL community. In this community, I go deeper with full property design breakdowns, live mapping reviews, and it's a community of growth-minded hunters who are very serious about taking their whitetail game to the next level. If you're interested, you can find a link for that community down in the description below. Thank you for watching this video, and good luck out there this season.